So this video originally included a lot of references to the fact that Fate Extra Record is never coming out, because of course it's not. But, well, yeah, that happened. That certainly happened. And if I time this video correctly, it's probably happening not long after this goes up. So, expect to see my reactions to that sometime in the very, very near future, as soon as I can get it edited. So hey everyone, I was not originally planning on doing this video. Honestly, the original plan was to do all of the Fate Extra game franchise, so Extra, CCC, and the 2 Extella games, as kind of one long retrospective, but it sort of dawned on me a day after I said I'd be doing that on stream that I don't want to have to remember my playthrough of each and every game, and if I don't do it this way, I'm going to forget, or I'm going to have to replay each game off stream. So instead, I'm just going to do individual reviews, and we're going to go ahead and just chop it up, It'll all go in the same playlist. So it's still going to be kind of a series here, so it'll be the Fate Extra Series Retrospective. It's going to release in parts, and the series, at least as it's planned now, is going to include the following: Fate Extra, the Perfect Patch, the fan mod; Fate Extra Last Encore, the anime; the Fate Extra manga; Fate Extra CCC, followed by both CCC's mangas, although I think both are currently incomplete. Then we go to Extella, and then the FGO Seraph main interlude, followed by Fate Extella Link, and then finally Fate Extra Record, once it finally releases. Now, that order might be subject to change. I'm going to be honest here, Fate Extra Record's a bit higher on my priorities, and I'm going to be streaming that basically at launch, regardless of whether or not I've finished up, say, I'll probably done CCC by then, but regardless of whether or not I've finished up the Extella games or the Seraph main interlude. And I may still do a wrap-up video when it's all over that just retrospectives the entire thing all at once. Whether or not that includes Extra Record will depend on its release. It probably will at this point. I can't imagine we get the trailer later today, probably, and it doesn't include a release window, at least. And the other thing is, I mentioned a few manga in there. Those manga are probably going to be in varying different types of mediums, like how I cover them in the retrospective. Fate Extra, the manga, I'm actually planning on doing it off the shelf with Seki. I'm curious to see what what her thoughts on this story are going to be. But the CCC mangas, because they're neither fully finished nor fully translated, especially in the case of the original CCC manga, I'm not planning on doing all of them. We're not going to finish it, most likely, unless Foxtail finishes up before I get to it. So, just bear that in mind as we go forward here. So, enough talk about the actual retrospective. Let's move on to the topic of this video, Fate Extra for the PSP. Specifically the fan patch that fixes up the translation, adds a few subtitles in there and places like the battle where they weren't before. That actually ends up being rather important. If you're going to play it at this point, I do kind of recommend playing the patch and not the original translation, because the original translation, it's fine enough from what I understand, but there are certain things they didn't bother subtitling, which in some cases makes boss fights harder. So, I'm going to be honest here. Part of the side effect of me doing this so quickly after I finish streaming the Tomomono Maya route is I've not done the Nero or Nameless routes. To my understanding, most of the differences are gameplay differences. Tomomono Maya being the hardest route, and to my understanding, Nero being the easiest route. So, at this point, I've had the hardest experience, and that might color my opinions on the gameplay section here. So just bear that in mind. So I don't think it matters much that I haven't played the Nero or Nameless routes. Not because it probably wouldn't round out my gameplay experience much, but because I'm already mostly a story guy. So, while I will have my opinions on the gameplay, I think most of them probably do hold up to both routes still, and it's the story we're primarily going to be looking at the story here later. So outside of this brief gameplay discussion, most of what I wanted to talk about today is the story. But regarding that gameplay, I'm actually a little shocked in how much I enjoyed it. I mean, the entire thing is just magic, rock, paper, scissors. It's not that deep, but it ends up feeling honestly kind of satisfying to master. Or not even master, just to get down. Like once you start recognizing an enemy pattern, or when you start being able to play it safer with like actual strategies until you can sort of get that enemy's pattern. Now, again, this is a Tomomo experience. I will say, the game, before you figure it out, is brutal and almost entirely RNG dependent. And I genuinely cannot recommend at all that you play this on original hardware. Not on the normal mode, at least. If you're playing on original hardware, do yourself a favor, play the easy mode. Because on original hardware, you don't have save states. And normally, I'm not the kind of person that actually needs save states in my games. I'm actually normally fine replaying parts, but there's no saving at all during the levels, and that's the only time you really get to grind. And you will need to grind. The game even gives you like target levels that you want to make sure you hit before you finish off the week. This isn't the type of game you can just run through the story sections and be good on. You do need to spend some time grinding in the arena, and that can sometimes take 15 to 30 minutes to get yourself up a couple levels every day. It's not too bad, but all it takes is that one stray RNG, like horrible RNG attack to just screw over a run completely. And if you're playing without save states, congratulations, you just lost like 20 to 30 minutes. And that's assuming you're not playing on a story-based day where you have a little mini-boss where you have to survive 3 rounds. Those days would be even worse on original hardware because those are actually pretty damn likely to kill you. If you don't have save states, you're either grinding before that and then losing that and then losing all your progress, or you're winning that and you're risking losing that by grinding. And it's never, no matter how overleveled you get, you are never quite safe in the arena from just wiping in one fight. It's never not on the table, even once you've started filling in enemy patterns. Yeah, if you're playing this on original hardware, do yourself a favor, just play on easy mode. Just get the little healing station in the area and just stick around it as close as you can while grinding. It's going to be longer, it's going to be more tedious, but if you're playing on original hardware, it's a PSP. I'm pretty sure you can pick up and put that thing down relatively easily. At least I hope so. I hope so. I've never played this in the PSP. I really hope so if you are playing it on original hardware. Probably the most interesting part, or the most fun part, are the actual boss fights. What's funny is they are, in my opinion, much more subject to RNG bullshit than even the regular enemies are, because they have a lot more patterns they'll play with, and they are far more capable of taking you down in one hit than the random enemy mooks in the dungeons or in the arena. That said, I never felt once like it was unfair. And that might be because you can go right back into the boss fights. It's not like you lose a boss fight and have to redo an entire arena day. No, you can just go right back into it. Just, oh, I died. All right, we're going to try that again. And I think that goes a long way to making them feel pretty satisfying to figure out. Well, yes, it can feel bad to lose very late into the boss fight. If I wasn't rushed for time, like trying to make sure I wasn't streaming till midnight fighting every boss, I think I greatly appreciate how satisfying it was to beat every boss. It felt like they all had, like, you could feel their personalities in their kits, and it was actually it was unique, it was special. You can feel their personalities in their kits, like in the patterns they're using. So figuring it out, like just figuring out what a boss's pattern is just infinitely satisfying. I will say that, like, the biggest RNG bullshit spot in the bosses is probably the Noble Phantasms, because they all kind of function differently. Once you know how one works, you can generally stop it, but there's a couple instances where I don't think any level of preparedness will actually help you. But sort of consequently, I never felt like I had to grind more than I did. I hit the target levels typically, maybe 1 or 2 levels above it, and just smart play and thinking about things, I could usually clear out the actual boss fight itself at the end of every week. Now, I mentioned before I'm a story guy. I like myself a good story. So my thoughts on the story was that overall the story was kind of I hate to say it, but once you round out the highs and the lows, the story really comes together to be like peak mid. It had its really, really good parts. Primarily, I'm talking about the first half of the game prior to a route split that's separate from your original servant choice. Everything in that section feels kind of tight. Character dialogue, the NPCs feel interesting to talk to, but once you clear that bit, the world starts to feel more dead. It makes sense given that there's literally people dying in the world. Like, that's explained pretty well in the story. Like, there's just less living people in the world as you move through each individual week. But along with the world feeling more dead, it doesn't really change the gameplay dynamic of the overworld. So what ends up happening is it starts to feel a lot less like you're getting interesting world building and a lot more like you're just really meandering, going through the motions. And then on top of that, although that is a route split that separates the first and second halves of the game, the route splits feels a lot more meaningless than it probably should. The two characters that you're sort of picking from almost feel indistinguishable writing-wise outside of a few key scenes. The actions they take are pretty much identical, and it kind of feels like they shouldn't be. It just leads to sort of the mid to late portions of the game feeling incredibly formulaic, especially if you go back and do another playthrough of the second half like I did. It might be better if you play through the first half again, but even then, you don't want to do it in short succession. For a game that has a complete route split and multiple routes at that, I think in total there's 6 routes if you do each servant on each side of that late game route split. And yet, the experience you're actually getting just feels inconsequential in its differences. I think the problem probably comes more in that all of it, from the late game route split to the servant pick, none of it feels substantial. It feels more like you're picking a starter Pokemon in a Pokemon game than it feels like you're picking a different route in Samurai Remnants, Fate Stay Night, or Tsukihime. It's really, really underwhelming outside of the few unique boss fights and a couple unique character beats. And I wish I could say it gets better, but it doesn't really at that point. The climax is one of the most disappointing Type Moon climaxes I've ever seen. The final boss just doesn't feel like a final boss. The entire game just kind of fizzles out at the end. That said, for what it lacks in actual story structure and in substantial changes or real depth of the world in the late game, I think thematically there is a lot of substance here. There's a lot to break down, and I actually do appreciate, like, just the different readings I can take on this game. So, why don't we get into some spoiler critiques here? Like, I'll talk about the parts of the story that really disappointed me, or maybe a part or two that I liked, and then I'll break down those themes, because I don't hate the story. I don't. It's alright. It's just underwhelming in some areas that feel kind of key to tell an interesting story. I'll say most of what I like in this story is probably going to end up in the analysis section. Everything I could possibly say nice about the story is probably going to be included in my analysis more than here, because that's really where the bulk of my positive feelings lie. I'm just going to use this section to throw out a couple of my critiques, a couple of areas that really I did not care for the game, and really go into just slightly more detail. Chief among them, Twice Peaceman, was a bad villain. Like, impressively bad. Thematically, he's fine. He's fine thematically. But story-wise, he has zero presence across the entire game. And then his ass just comes up in the climax, gives you an exposition dump to his history, his plan, and suddenly the Buddha appears, and there's your final boss. Like, I get it. There are parallels between him and Hakuno in direct history they technically have together. But We got none of that across the entire game. Like, he appears as a little ghost here and there in a couple of the weeks, and you get his voice at the beginning of every week, but you have no real indication to his characterization or who he is prior to this. Like, you get the little blurbs at the beginning of every week. That's nothing. That could have been a generic narrator, and it changes almost zero parts of the plot. He has no knowledge that Hakuno is also an NPC, so it seems. So he has no investment in the final boss. The only reason Hakuno has any investment in the final boss is because it tells him or her that NPCs can't make wishes and they want to get out of there. It is more detached than if we just had Leo as the final boss again. And there's next to no build-up to the appearance of the fucking Buddha. Like, there's no build-up at all for any of this final section. It also just doesn't help that the Buddha is a one-phase boss fight that is piss easy because you have all your items. If you saved up like some of your good items across the entire game, which it's not hard to save them up, there's not a lot of context that you really absolutely need to use them in this game. The Buddha falls apart like wet paper if you have your items, if you have good items with you. Even mediocre items could probably get through it. There is technically a time limit that can lead to a bad ending. But never once, even when I wasn't thinking about using my items like that, I didn't feel like I was in any danger at all. And it's only one phase. It's a single phase boss fight. You finish that boss fight, and the game just kind of ends. T.H.E Peaceman's just like, oh, I lost. Gonna just walk away now. And the Buddha just kind of is like, this is over now. I'm going to leave. Bye. And the game ends. Like, T.H.E Peaceman did jack all. I just gotta say, T.H.E Peaceman might be one of my least favorite Type Moon villains. Period. I alluded to it earlier when I was talking about the route split, but the other part of the game that really kind of frustrated me was just how not different Rin and Ronnie's characters were. With Rin, it was kind of fine because most of her personality is copy-pasted from Fate Stay Night Rin. So I still got a lot of personality shining through for her, and her characterization and actions feel in line mostly with the character that I'm filling in the blanks here for. And, okay, I have to admit, the line, Rin went from comatose to bitch in 30 seconds or something like that, was beautiful. But Ronnie in particular felt like such wasted potential in this game. Like, there's stuff there. There's like parallels between her and Hakuno both not being human that will work. But all of her actions, if you play the Ronnie route second, just mirror directly with Rin's. You don't get the idea that she's that much different outside of one scene when you first save her at the route split, where you see her reaction is very different from Rin's. The timing of it's the same because they have to be, the routes have to play out the exact same outside of a couple of the boss fights. But the way they both go about expressing their distaste at being eliminated from the Grail War, that part's unique enough to where I like that enough. But for the rest of the game, Ronnie just felt like the more boring character route to pick. And I don't think it helps that it feels like even the ending, Ronnie had much, much less of a sentimental reaction to receiving Hakuno's current, like, living body location than Rin did. I don't know. Like, I hope the remake really touches up Ronnie's route a lot, or at least makes the two routes feel a lot more distinct than they were. I'd be lying if I said that this work's themes were the deepest, or that I liked them as much as I liked, say, Tsukihime's, or Samurai Remnants, Avalon the Phase, or even Mahotsukai no Yoru. I really don't think this is one of Type Moon's strongest works thematically, but it still has plenty to, like, sink my teeth into. It's got a little bit of a meat to it, a little bit of juice. One thing I actually do appreciate here in this story is It's held together by probably one of the more endearing silent protagonists I've seen in a video game. Hakuno is silent really only in actual spoken words. We get a shit ton of internal dialogue that really fleshes out his or her character to be very, very introspective and philosophical about their weird ass existence in this Holy Grail War. This game really can be summed up character wise for Hakuno as a massive existential crisis, since Hakuno lacks any sort of memory, and then later we find out that he or she is an NPC, so they're not even technically a real person. And it's impressive to see Hakuno, as the war goes on, really grieve for the other masters' deaths, because he or she has to recognize that those other masters were real people that actually had life goals and aspirations. Whereas Hakuno is literally historyless and is figuring out their goals as the story goes on. And it's all really good juxtaposition to the actual reality of the situation, which is sort of this ironic twist that although in world Hakuno is an NPC surrounded by real people that they're killing, we're the only real person in this game, in this single player game, killing a bunch of NPCs that feel like real people. And the game goes further beyond this. I haven't watched them myself, but from what I've heard, every NPC has a bad end that if you choose not to continue when you lose a fight, it gives them a little outro, which honestly just goes to make the characters feel that much more well-rounded, the fact that this exists at all. It sort of forces you into thinking, is it right that you're killing these NPCs? It gives you a bit, like a slight moral conundrum. Nothing on the level of, like, Undertale really pushing that onto you, but I feel like it leans in that same direction, which is impressive. It came out before then. I think I heard somewhere that Nasu likes Undertale, and I wonder if the similarities here in trying to make you question just sort of the morality of killing NPCs, if that might be part of why. And that's all just Hakuno's internal conflict. It's really good. It makes you sort of just consider the emotional weight behind killing characters, like fully fictional characters. It's interesting. It's interesting. I kind of like seeing that sometimes when you've got a silent protagonist. But I think where Fate Extra really, really excels is its overall world building. The world of Fate Extra is so unique, even though we don't get to see a lot of it firsthand. A lot of what we find out about the world comes from exposition from characters like Rin or Leo, or in background material. But regardless, even though some of it's in background material, if you really want like the deep history here, the actual state of the world is pretty well talked about, especially in the Rin route when you're fighting Leo. Another reason why I think Rin ends up being the more interesting route in this game. This game really plays around with the idea of stagnation versus progress. I guess just a little background here, if you're, for whatever reason, not as familiar with some of the events of FGO Part 2, because this does kind of tie into the same concepts here. In Type Moon, the multiverse is not infinite. It is finite. It's like how the universe is ever expanding, but there is a limit to how much energy the universe will contain. So the Type Moon multiverse will sort of regulate that expansion by pruning timelines that are too far off human history and don't show any sort of promise of human development. So either timelines where human progress is completely halted because they're too content in their ways, or timelines where human progress is halted because some apocalyptic event happens and humans have no means of recovering. Fate Extra exists in a world that is on the precipice of that sort of apocalyptic ending, or of that stagnation ending. Both options we know in this franchise are on the table and both imminent at the same time. This is because in the near past, a series of disasters and wars left much of the planet in complete chaos and wiped out entire countries, to my understanding. And so one powerful family managed to basically rein all that chaos in and take control of it, but threw the world into sort of a technological and cultural stagnation that prevented humans from really changing over the course of 50 to 100 years. Really, there's very few people that oppose them outside of the occasional described as terrorist cells that are aware of sort of this conundrum of how the world is just not changing under the iron grip of this one family, the Harways. And amongst those terrorists are our gal Rin Tosaka. And they're kind of the dichotomy we see throughout most of this game is Leo versus Rin. Rin being progress, Leo being stagnation. I almost wish that those were the roots we picked from. Hakuno throughout the story is confronted with the question of, is it better for the world to remain stagnant and unmoving and unchanging, or is it better for the world to take risks but move towards a future? Now, we're never told directly about the pruning phenomenon that I mentioned earlier, but that's sort of it's a Type Moon underlying theme across the franchise, and it will come up later in the Fate Extra retrospective here. Especially in the Rin route, you do get this sort of almost definitive answer that no, it's not better that the world remains stagnant. We should be taking risks. We should be risking as much as we can to keep the world moving forward. But right at the end, it does throw a wrench in that plan. This is like the one area where I can kind of appreciate T.H.E Peaceman. Because T.H.E Peaceman represents the polar opposite of Leo and is sort of an extreme take on Rin's perspective. Rin throughout the story is clarified to be a terrorist. So a probably violent opposer of the current regime. T.H.E Peaceman wants to cause eternal war, basically, in order to propel humanity towards basically you're progressing whether you like it or not. Technology, especially, tends to develop very quickly in war, didn't you know? So, what you're faced with here is sort of the extreme end of what Rin is, who Rin is in this game. And it's almost interesting to see that Rin forcibly turns herself away from that and recognizes the flaws in that sort of mentality. I think Hakuno describes it best. The goal is for a future, not to see dead people. This is a particularly interesting conclusion for Hakuno to reach, because Hakuno has spent this entire game racing towards their own future by killing everyone in their way, whether they like it or not. They're sacrificing lives for their uncertain future, and then they tell T.H.E Peaceman that's not what they should do. It's curious to me, but I think that provides a little bit of depth to sort of Hakuno's character and situation. Hakuno's not a perfectly logical NPC here. This isn't a critique of how the theme is handled either. It's just a curious little thing I noticed with Hakuno, in terms of some internal character hypocrisy that makes sense and really does contribute to the themes here. The actual in-game justification for why that hypocrisy is okay is because Hakuno's not looking to just prolong the world, because T.H.E Peaceman is just looking to prolong the world by forcing humanity into basically eternal conflict. Hakuno is actively seeking a future, an actual future for themselves, not just to prolong their own existence. They really aren't the same, and Hakuno's fate at the end of the game of basically dissolving themselves into data, because they realize they don't have a future, when they could prolong their existence by not going in, like the way T.H.E Peaceman did, it's actually a pretty good character beat, in my opinion. Now, as for my actual reading of these themes, I think that this reads pretty damn politically. In some ways, I find it kind of remarkable how uncertain its politics are, but nonetheless condemning what it knows is wrong. Leo and Rin here are your opposing views. The stagnation versus progress. My immediate instinct here is to immediately classify Leo's goals as being maintaining the status quo. Someone with more modern political sensibilities may even recognize Leo as being a stand-in for, say, neoliberalism, while Rin is a stand-in for progressivism. The world falls apart around the Harway family that Leo is head of, and yet the family makes no effort to actually put a stop to it, to prevent the world from falling apart. Instead, they hold it in place as much as possible, even as it's failing, and they're a powerful family. They probably know it can't continue this way. And then you have Rin here, who, as I said earlier, probably stands in for progressivism, looking at the entire situation and saying, this isn't working, we need change. And she does this in the face of overwhelming power, and I mean overwhelming. She says in no uncertain terms in her route that once you kill Leo, you're probably going to be hunted down and killed for that when you get out, if you get out, just because of that situation. Another reason I'm kind of interested to see what would happen after the game's events in the real world. A potentially opposing read of this that I'm not necessarily sure I stand on, because this doesn't feel as in line with other themes I've seen out of Type Moon, would be a reading of Leo as a utilitarian political philosophy. Something not exactly parallel to it, but something more in line with, say, communism or socialism. Someone whose express purpose would be to stagnate progress because it will lead to more short-term overall happiness, knowing that the long-term probably doesn't exist anymore. In this reading, I would say that Rin probably stands in for individualism. I don't know if I'd say... I probably would not say capitalism, which is probably where your mind first goes to if I'm coming up with an opposite to communism or socialism. That feels even more against Type Moon's general themes that I've seen over time. But when I say that, I mean generally as an individualist thinker. Someone valuing just human self-determination. I think you might have got them a little bit less reading into it from the latter reading, the communism versus individualism reading of it. I'm more partial to status quo versus progress. I said progressivism, but it's probably closer to progress, not like literal modern day progressivism. Namely because I feel like that the status quo versus progress is just a lot more of a general, I don't want to say timeless, but it's more of a general theme, like more of a general direction of mankind sort of theme, which is a little bit more in line with what I tend to see Nasu writing. Well, I have seen a Type Moon work written in a way that I would describe as that communism versus individualism, or maybe even capitalism sort of theme. This is not that one. I won't say which one I would identify as that, but I will say there is one I've seen, and it's not a Nasu work. Nasu doesn't... I don't think Nasu... I've never seen Nasu to work in specific political ideologies or ones that feel more contemporary. Regardless, I think both readings are potentially valid here, especially once you get into T.H.E. Peaceman, because I think T.H.E. Peaceman as a villain works thematically under both readings. The first one in the status quo being the obvious actual human conflict, because status quos really can't exist in perpetually chaotic environments like war. So the reading of T.H.E. Peaceman in that situation makes plenty of sense. You'd probably read him as a warmonger under that sort of analysis, and like someone who's has a vested interest in keeping the political temperature hot but not ablaze. As for any potential anti-communism themes, you'd probably end up reading T.H.E. Peaceman as a stand-in for capitalism, as sort of the far reach of Rin's individualism. Raw capitalism being sort of a systemic, never-ending conflict that doesn't care who lives or dies so long as it can keep itself perpetuated. I genuinely do enjoy the themes of Fate Extra. I think it's nice having had this immediately off the bat, even my problems with the story aside, because I know that later works do not work with these themes at all, do not work with these more political themes. And if you didn't know, my major in a university was political science, so any chance to really stretch those muscles a bit, it's nice. It's nice to be able to really use my analytical muscles from there. Fate Extra is a bit of a paradoxical game. There's something special buried underneath it all. The gameplay is satisfying, but it's also infuriatingly RNG-based. The story is interesting, but isn't interested in the least in trying to tell a very coherent and satisfying story with a good payoff. And it's replayable, but lacks the variety in gameplay needed to keep itself from becoming tedious on repeat plays. It all ends up feeling very contradictory with conflicting goals at times. There is something truly good here if you are willing to concede to its shortcomings. I can see why it's always had a cult following, but I can also see why it maybe didn't take off at launch and why some people have a lot of frustrations with it. I think if you're new and you haven't played Fate Extra before, it's probably worth just waiting for the remake at this point. It already looks to have expanded story, so hopefully it solves some of our story issues. The gameplay has been mixed up, so while I do hope we don't lose some of the satisfying nature of really learning your servant and learning how the enemies work, ideally it'll make it a lot fairer. And really, at this point, it might just be worth waiting for the remake before deciding whether or not you're going to take the effort to really invest yourself in this one. Especially since you know it's coming much sooner than I had originally thought it was. With that, I will see you next time. Next up should be my review of Fate Extra Last Encore. I don't anticipate that one will be that meaty. But hey, expect it to be shorter, but that's probably not a bad thing for that anime. Alright, see you next time.